For anybody who doesn't know, I'm Alice Bloom. Most people know me. And I am the chair of our local Larchmont-Mamaroneck League study of U.S. immigration policy. That's a tough one. First of all, let me introduce some of our study group members. I don't do this all by myself. I could not do it without the help of Mary Lee Berridge. Mary Lee, where are you? Raise your hands so we know who you are. Elsa Puerto-Ruben. Elsa's over here. And Jerry Lynn Fields. Jerry Lynn is in the back, and if you need any help, she'll be back there. Rosita Fickle is also an enormous help to us. She's away this week, but promises she's going to watch us on TV. Okay, a special thanks to the Larchmont Public Library that allowed us to be here today and is co-sponsoring our event. As you may know, this is the second forum in our study of U.S. immigration policy. The League, for anybody who doesn't know, is a grassroots, nonpartisan organization founded originally to help women get the vote. Now we're devoted to helping people, all people, become informed participants in government. So, at the League is also an advocacy organization. Yes, we lobby. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. And it's also an organization with tremendous integrity. We only lobby when we have studied an issue and come to consensus on it. I can't help, I must introduce Ruth Heinerfeld. Ruth is hiding over there and she's shaking her head. Ruth lives in our community, and Ruth was president of the National League of Women Voters. And Ruth moderated the debate between John Anderson and Jimmy Carter. And
Reagan. Don't forget.
But she doesn't want us to know. And I must tell you this story. Ruth officiated, I guess you were president at the first national convention that I attended. I don't even want to say when. It probably would have been 82. I was a child, and Ruth was just, a year old. And I remember after it, Ruth told us that she only allowed her mom and Jimmy Carter to call her Ruthie. Remember that story? I hope you don't mind my sharing it with you, but I just thought that was so endearing. So we have many other illustrious guests. I am not going to even try to introduce everyone. I know that I will miss someone. Susie Oppenheimer is sitting in the back, and she is going to slip out early, I promise you. But we appreciate your taking the time to be here. If you do need to slip out, we appreciate your being here. Now, we are going to try to keep this as conversational as possible. I'm going to introduce our guests in just a moment. I do want to tell you it's the second forum. The first one was on the history of immigration, in which we saw the film, The History of Immigration to the Lower East Side, which was provided to us by the Tenement Museum of the City of New York. They were very gracious. They were so excited that we were doing this study that they gave us that film to use solely for the purpose of our program and did not charge us at all. And our guest in conversation afterwards was Michelle Wooker, who is a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York and the author of a book called Lockout. There is a copy of the book in the back. We commend it to you. It is a wonderful history of U.S. immigration policy and how we have treated immigrants in the past. It will open your eyes. We all learned so much. Just a little heads up on some future forums. On November 13th, we will have our next forum on U.S. policy and the path to citizenship with immigration attorney Robin Bicall. We're going to be doing that at a forum we call Breakfast at Night. As you know, we host a monthly issues forum on the first Friday of the month, and once in a while, we have Breakfast at Night, so that all of our friends who can't join us in the morning can at least join us then. So at that night, we're going to have the third forum in our study, and that will be on the path to citizenship. At our next breakfast, which will be Friday, December 7th, we're going to try to address global economic and healthcare issues pertinent to immigration. Watch your email. And I ask that everybody sign in, and if you do not receive our emails, make sure you give us your email in very clear fashion, and you'll just get notice of the upcoming events. And the last event we hope to do in our series will be on January 22. That date is almost written in. It's an event called Immigrant Voices, which will be devoted to readings of published writings by immigrants. So we'll get more about that on email. Our study concludes at the end of January with consensus. And those of you who've ever been involved in a consensus know how arduous that is. Now, we felt that the forums are so important, we've opened everything to the public. consensus meetings by our bylaws are only open to league members. So we've left some membership envelopes on the back table. And if you are not a member, we hope that you become one. Please do. One more thanks to LMC-TV. LMC, our public access station, is taping all of our forums. We're broadcast on our public access station here in Larchmont, Mamaroneck. And we also hope to make DVD copies of our forums available in our library so that you can borrow them. And if possible, we will also have copies available for sale, but you'll hear more about that on email, so make sure you have signed up. Okay, we have a very, very impressive panel of experts sitting to my left. And I am so impressed, and I thank you all for being here today. And some of you have come quite a distance, and I appreciate that. I do want to take some time, and I'm going to read your bios because I think our audience needs to know who you are. So bear with me just another minute. Do you want some cookies and juice? I know. So you do? Okay, well, we could do that. Okay. To my left, Joseph Berger. Joe lives in Larchmont, Mamaroneck, and you may know him and his family. Joe is an education columnist, or the education columnist for the New York Times, and has been a reporter and editor with the Times since 1984. For 3 years until 2006, he was a senior metropolitan reporter specializing in feature stories on the city's changing neighborhoods and ethnic makeup, and the articles became the basis of his new book, which we have available for sale, The World in a City, Traveling the Globe Through the Neighborhoods of New York, which was published just now, September 2007. He was a religion correspondent from 1985 to 1987, covering the Pope's trip to 10 American cities in 9 days, and national education correspondent from 87 to 90, a period when American school curricula were under attack as too European-focused. From 1990 until 1993, he covered New York City schools and colleges where there was a bitter controversy over condom distribution and instruction. He's the recipient of the 1993 Education Writers Association Award for exposing abuses in bilingual education. In 1993, he was named bureau chief in White Plains, the bureau that covers Westchester and upstate New York. In September 1999, he was appointed deputy education editor, where he helped direct coverage of the changes in national education policy, the firing of one New York school's chancellor and the shaking tenure of another, and a series on the first year of a new teacher. Prior to joining the Times, Joe worked as Newsday's religion writer, where he 3 times won the Supple Award given by the Religion News Writers Association, its highest honor. Joe worked at the New York Post, and he was also an English teacher at a Bronx junior high school. Joe was born in the Soviet Union in 1945. He is an immigrant himself, the son of Jewish refugees from Poland, and he published a memoir, Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust. It was about his family's experience as immigrants in New York City in the 50s and 60s. It was selected as a New York Times notable book and has received warm praise from reviewers in the Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, and from me. Elie Wiesel called the book a powerful and sweetly melancholic memoir, brilliantly written. Joe grew up in Manhattan and the Bronx. He's a graduate of Columbia University Grad School of Journalism, City College, and the Bronx High School of Science. He lives in Westchester with his wife Brenda, a psychoanalyst, and their daughter Annie, a junior at Northwestern. Welcome, Joe. Is it hard to listen to somebody talk about you?
No, but now I don't want you to read mine.
I think you're gonna like it. All right, and to Joe's left is Dr. Paul Freed. Everybody here knows Paul, as he likes to be called, is our superintendent of schools in Mamaroneck. He's been an educator for over 30 years. He started when he was 10. He began his career in the Pauling schools as an elementary school teacher after 12 years in the classroom and holding some teacher leader positions. He was named principal of the Pauling Elementary School. He left Pauling after 2 years as principal to assume the role of elementary principal of Brookside School in the Ossining schools. He was the principal of this school for 10 years and then moved to Park School, also in Ossining, for 6 years. At this school, he led the children, faculty, staff, and community to become a nationally recognized Blue Ribbon School of Excellence. During Paul's last 3 years in Ossining, he occupied the position of assistant superintendent for elementary education and human resources. In the spring of 2005, he was named superintendent of the Mamaroneck schools. This is his 3rd year in our district. Paul earned his BA and MA at the State University of New York at New Paltz and his doctorate at Teachers College, Columbia University, in the field of educational administration and leadership. He has extensive experience working closely with a diverse community, and in his first 2 years in Mamaroneck has brought additional resources to the district to meet the needs of diverse learners. Thank you for spending the evening with us. Now, Dr. Howard Smith, immediately to Paul's left, thank you for joining us. Paul comes to us from Tarrytown, and it was a real schlep tonight, I'm sure. He received his PhD in educational psychology from Columbia Teachers College, began his career in Western Massachusetts as a special ed director and school psychologist, then served as an elementary principal for 7 years before moving to upstate New York in 1988 to serve as a school superintendent in a socioeconomically diverse rural school district. He shares that he didn't know what real diversity was until he was appointed superintendent for the public schools of the Tarrytowns in 2001. Howard has taught graduate classes in educational administration, most recently at Fordham, and he reviews manuscripts for Corwin Press. He occasionally presents at conferences, most notably at an international conference in Beijing in 2000. I wonder if you know that Mamaroneck has a Chinese program.
Found with great interest.
Okay, Richard, we'll get to you next, and I promise you will not be disappointed. Richard Berman became president of Manhattanville College in 1994, a former McKinsey consultant with a successful career as a leader in the public and private sector. Richard applied his managerial skills to save the college from financial ruin while revitalizing its core values into a compelling and timely mission: to educate students to become ethically and socially responsible leaders for the global community. Today, Manhattanville is thriving as a top-rated liberal arts college and is recognized as a top-tier college by U.S. News & World Report, the Princeton Review, and the Fisk Guide to Colleges. During his tenure at Manhattanville, Richard has reached out globally, making it possible for foreign, merit-based scholars to attain a college education in the U.S. As a result, there are students attending Manhattanville from 59 countries. In the spring of 2006, he spent a month as a Fulbright senior specialist to help establish a new university in western Uganda. He also is vice chairman of the board for Seeds of Peace, an international organization that works to break the cycle of violence in youth from war-torn nations. Through his personal involvement, he has attracted the high number of Seed students to Manhattanville. In 2002, he fulfilled a personal dream by visiting the Middle East students in their own homes. President Berman serves his community beyond the campus with a number of leadership activities. As a nationally recognized healthcare expert, he serves as chairman of the board of the Westchester Med Center in Valhalla and is board member of the Health Insurance Plan of New York Foundation. He's chairman of the advisory board of the Westchester Jewish Chronicle, a board member of Keough Academy, the Japanese high school, and a board member of the Holocaust and Human Rights Study Center of Westchester County. I don't think that was so shabby.
I don't know who it was.
Jose Flores, the last member of our panel, but not the least, is the Vice President for Enrollment Management in Manhattanville College. I think something we used to call admissions. Is that correct?
Yeah. He's got that and financial aid and a whole bunch of other stuff.
First is Director of Admissions and now is Vice President of Enrollment at Manhattanville College. Jose has always been at the cutting edge of his field. First with the online open house and now with the online admissions community. Jose is an expert at utilizing technology to help communicate with prospective students. Applications have skyrocketed under his leadership. Before coming to Manhattanville, Jose worked at the Justice Family Coalition and at Bristol Myers. A native of Puerto Rico, he came to the Lower East Side of New York at the age of 16 and graduated from Manhattanville College, class of 93. He's currently a member of the New England, New York State, Hawaiian, and National Association for College Admissions Counseling, and many, many other associations. I will not name them all. Jose has traveled extensively throughout the world, giving admissions presentations, including at the National Conference for Admissions Counseling. In addition, he has served on several admissions panels and has been seen on News 12, the Journal News, and various stations in Yonkers and the Dominican Republic speaking about the admissions process, and now on LMC-TV. Add that to the list. Thank you all, gentlemen. I am very impressed, and I really do thank you on behalf of our audience for spending your precious time with us. Now, as I said, we're going to try to keep this about as conversational as we can with a group of this size. This is a yeoman's task for a moderator. So I know I can count on your cooperation. What we've decided to do is ask a question of each panelist, allow him to explore that issue as broadly as he'd like, and allow the other panelists to weigh in again if they would like, and then open questions to the audience on that particular issue. We're going to do the first one and see how it goes. If I can keep control of you and stay on target, then we'll proceed that way. If I need to pull it back, I apologize, but we don't have all night. Although I'd love to keep you here, I could lock the doors. And so we're going to try. And I know that you're not going to be shy about participating. So, my first question, and these ideas were shared with the panelists before. As I told them, there's no gotcha here. We really thoroughly appreciate their being here and their vantage point and how they will share that with us. My first question is to you, Joe. From your research and observations, please compare current immigrants' attitudes and commitment to education to those attitudes and commitment of previous generations of immigrants. And do you see any difference between documented and undocumented students and families' attitudes and commitment toward education?
You know, I think there's probably a lot less difference than many people might suppose. There's always been a variety of immigrant attitudes towards education. But I feel like they could ultimately they even out as groups get Americanized. The classic case of immigrant overachievement, are the Jews who came over in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and went on to substantial accomplishments in the second and third generations. But and often when that's analyzed, people talk about a tradition of education that comes from the study of the Torah, and I think there's a lot to that. But what you find is other immigrant groups eventually do the same thing. And also move into academia, and move into intellectual pursuits, and move into successful positions in all kinds of areas that require education. In my latest book, about the neighborhoods of New York. You go to a neighborhood. Thank you. You go to a neighborhood like Bensonhurst, which everyone looks at as this working class. They filmed that kind of highlighted Bensonhurst was Saturday Night Fever, Bensonhurst and Bay Ridge. So kind of working class Italians looking toward Saturday night as the big night of their lives. But Bensonhurst now is a third Chinese, and the reason is the Italians who lived in Bensonhurst, who came from blue-collar families where there was a tradition of, the son goes into the same business as the same trade as the father. Well, that's being broken now. Italians are getting educated in college and graduate school in large numbers. I mean, Bart Giamatti became the president of Yale. I could go on with a list of, if you need them. And that's changed now. And what's happened? Italians are leaving the blue-collar neighborhoods of the city, and they're moving to the suburbs. The same thing's happening with Greeks, Greek immigrants. You go to Astoria, which everybody thinks is the neighborhood where all the Greeks in the United States, in the New York area live. They're leaving Astoria because they went to college, they went to graduate school, they're becoming doctors and lawyers and academics, and you find this path continues. Sometimes there are differences between people who come from very rural areas. They may take, when they come here, they may have very little tradition of education. Or they may not even have access to schooling. I mean, in some of the Latin American countries, people may not go all the way through junior high school and high school. My father came from Poland. He had a 5th grade education. That's what you did in Poland if you were living in a peasant area. My mother, who lived in a suburban area got a 7th grade education. There was no, and that's still true today in some countries, but when people come over here, they come to the system that requires them to go all the way through 12th grade, and where now college is seen as a mandatory. And that changes the whole the attitudes towards education. And I think you're going to see a lot of that, the traditional American ladder with many immigrant groups. Obviously, there are groups like the Chinese and Koreans who come here with, they bring a certain ambition toward quickly moving up the American ladder through education, and it's become kind of almost a stereotype. But I think. And of course you see that in places like Stuyvesant High School and Bronx Science, that they're 50% Asian these days. But that I believe that a lot of that is going to move through all the different immigrant groups eventually, and we'll see that that same kind of successes and ascent that you saw.
So from your perspective, and seeing so many different immigrant groups, you're seeing that same interest in access to education?
I am, yeah.
And does it matter?
Maybe not immediately, because it takes a while to develop that kind of, it may take a generation or two to develop that kind of culture, but eventually I do.
Do you see a difference between people we call legal and undocumented?
It's not something that I've looked at, but I'm going to guess they may be, because people who come over here illegally in an undocumented fashion tend more likely to come from rural areas where they have less access to education. So there might be a difference, but eventually I think that evens out.
Interesting perspective. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Would anybody else like to comment on this issue, this question?
I actually would like to say something. Being on the sort of college admission side, I'll say two things actually. I think in part of the college admission side, I do see pretty much the same on both documented and undocumented students. Actually, many of the undocumented students that get to my office tend to be really high academics. It's quite interesting. And most guidance counselors in the community are in fact advocating for the young people. Now, this is not their parents. We're talking about the children who probably arrived here at an early age, maybe 1 or 2 years old, and are they really from those countries because they've really been raised in this country, and they tend to excel. The other statement that I would make is, I'm fortunate, I don't know, it's fortunate for me, not fortunate for my wife. I'm married to a woman who's from Macau, and she is partly Chinese and partly Portuguese. But she's she's involved with the Chinese community here in Westchester County. And there is a very, very strong commitment towards education there, to the point where my children, they go to school on Saturdays in Edgemont High School. The Chinese community has created a wonderful program to infuse more education. They're talking about SAT prep, they're talking about all these wonderful things to members of the community. So, just wanted to answer that.
Thank you.
And I would just say that the ones that we see who want admission to college are probably not a typical kid, but the ones that we see, I would say, and some of them came here older. I was thinking of Edmund
Copley,
who came here. We see the ones who have been able to be successful in our curriculum, wherever it is, in Westchester, in Rockland counties, in Fairfield County. So they've already been successful in school, and they've had to really often be more aggressive and more successful in filling out and fitting for themselves. And I think they're more mature as a group, and I think they're better prepared, and they realize the benefit of the college education, and they're prepared to sort of do what they have to get it. It's not something that was just sort of, given to them and expected of them, and they'll get into some college somewhere. And so the ones we see, I would say we've had a lot of reward for, because they've been successful at college and then gone out and gotten some pretty good jobs and are giving back and care about the community and give back. So our values in terms of knowledge transfer, skill development, and a commitment to make the world a better place and give back, you feel it with them. It's a passion. It's not just sort of a process they're going through.
Now, you're seeing kids a little later on in the continuum, 18 and up. Paul, I can see you really want to get in on this now. You're looking at kids from, well,
Yeah,
kindergarten on.
In my experience prior to coming to Mamaroneck and now even here, I've worked with very, very young children and young families. One of my principalships was at a pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and first grade school. And even within that context, we began a program for the youngest learners ages birth through 3 years of age. And we've actually started that program here in this community. So in terms of looking at our immigrant parents and their interest in education, what I've seen is a great interest in that from the youngest learners on up. I think the differences between when they're starting out at 2 and 3 and 4 years old, and by the time the students become successful learners and are ready for college, is that parents at times, as they're just coming here, particularly from poorer countries, and in the Ossining schools, for example, many of the families are from Ecuador and from the rural parts of Ecuador, where they have not been in school and they may be 7 or 8 years old as they're coming here. And so the parents don't actually understand how to negotiate the schools. And through the educational process of working with of our newest parents to this country, parents begin to learn to become more assertive, because if they've had any experience at all, the cultural differences to them mean that they stand back and they allow the schools to do all of it. They have a reverence for the teacher and for the schools, and they believe at first they have no role in their child's education. Very different, of course, for our very sometimes overly involved, more affluent parents in all of our communities. A quasi-PTA group was created in the Ossining schools called Proyecto Alcance. And this group was designed to, in fact, create leadership among the Latino families and to eventually try to encourage a voice. And once that voice was encouraged through the help of some very talented social workers in the school system there, what we started to see are more and more parents coming out for meetings, until the numbers of parents coming out for those meetings rival the number of more affluent and more established parents coming out for the more traditional PTA meetings. And so again, I think it's empowering people, having them understand what the system calls for. Our American system of education calls for parents to be involved, and we know that from the research that children are more successful when their parents are involved. So.
And sometimes it's actually even, I mean, I'm glad you made that point, because sometimes the reasons why parents can't get involved come down to very simple things, like many of the parents work 2 jobs. You know, if you're an undocumented immigrant, or even if you are documented but you're only earning $7.50 an hour or $10 an hour, you may have to work 2 jobs. It's not easy to go to a PTA meeting, or go to a meeting with your kid's teacher on Parents' Teachers Night. We all take it for granted that we all show up in numbers with hundreds of questions for our teachers. But you know, I saw this. I did a story once in Newburgh, New York, heavily Latino school system. And they did the same thing that you did in Ossining, which is create a parents' council, and they got very, very involved, and that made a big difference. But just, you know, and then having a vehicle to get to school with. I mean, we all, all of us have cars. Many of the people who live in Newburgh don't have cars to go to a school, to go to school at night. I mean, they've somehow made a transportation arrangements to get to their jobs, but they may not have had a transportation arrangement to get to a school to visit with their teacher.
Interesting.
Just two other quick points. I think that parents, as I think was the tradition back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, parents want their children to succeed. They want their children to do better, so to speak, than they've done. That has been a tradition, I think, for a long time, and I think that it's something I've seen no matter who I've worked with in terms of parenting. The other thing is that here at the Hommocks Middle School, we're now in the second year of a project called PALMS, which is a project to help our parents, our Latino parents of middle school children, begin thinking about the college process as soon as possible, not to wait till the children are in high school. By then, of course, it can be too late. Some of the prerequisites may not have been taken in terms of coursework, thinking about the PSATs and the SATs. So this is an effort in our middle school to begin working with our Latino parents through a well-defined program, so that as the children move through our middle school into the high school, they're more ready for what the concept of going off to college would look like.
Part of the real challenge that we face, which is sort of trying to build that culture of appreciation of education in a population that doesn't necessarily bring that with them in the sense of our sort of middle-class view of what education means. And yet at the same time, picking up something that Paul said, what we really come to appreciate is, in spite of that lack of sort of a refined notion and a culture of appreciation of education in the former sense, the determination and the value for education, and it's sort of intuitively, is very strong. In many cases, I would say that the sheer sort of determination and desire exceeds a lot of what our more privileged families have coming in, because they kind of they assume it's going to be there. They don't really have to. They aren't conscious of what having to do anything special to access that. It's just a given. In the United States, you live in a community, you get a free public education, and it takes you as far as you want to go. We're dealing with a whole segment of the population that doesn't necessarily take that for granted, and so they do bring some attitudes, and you can tap those, and the challenge is trying to tap that with the families too, to challenge that channel, that interest and desire that's sort of natural, and to help them do it in ways that increasingly become more supportive of their children, and kind of setting aspirations for them and supporting higher aspirations for them than they might have otherwise had in their previous experiences.
I'm assuming that you cannot ask whether students are documented or undocumented. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you conclude, though, is there any basis to conclude that people who are undocumented might be more reticent to access education?
I
From your
think
experience.
Our experience is that there are at times people who are very afraid of any sort of bureaucratic system because they're afraid of the exposure. They think by providing too much information, something in fact may get transmitted to some authority, which can then perhaps move them out of housing or take them away from the job that they may hold, and they don't understand that the school system is not an agency that is going to do that, and yet they're concerned about sharing too much information. So it would be very frightening to them, for example, if a social service had to be contacted outside of the school, because then another group might in fact have too much access to their private information.
Some of these reservations also translate to ways that are counterproductive in terms of bringing resources to bear. For example, it can be expressed in terms of a reluctance to fill out forms that would otherwise qualify a child for free or reduced lunch, for example. So you do work with those kinds of issues at times.
Very interesting. All right, any questions or comments from the audience specifically on this issue? difference between generations and access and interest in education. Norm?
I think it's an interesting point that was brought up by several of the panelists. Mr. Berger and Mr. Flores both brought up that there are specific cultural groups that obviously education is extremely important. It's part of the basic culture, whether it be a Jewish group or Japanese or Chinese. In fact, it can be proven the fact that they actually create their own school systems. But from a personal experience, I found also that there's certain inherent value among parents. I had the opportunity to teach in East Harlem, the Southeast Bronx, and this was in, quote, the terrific New York City school system. But there were always kids, and this was the worst of societies as far as availability is concerned economically, but there were always that kids that would just stand out, and they would just advance in spite of all the hardships. And every time it's traceable to their parents were interested. The parents were the one that came. So my question is, besides the statement, is how do you relate from the school system in conjunction with what's going on with all the fears and the false statements back and forth with people talking to each other or at each other instead of to each other? How do you identify those kids and bring them into the system? Because education is the basic tool that raises any group up. Because with the education you get the jobs and you get the economic advantages.
Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I can start off in my end, and that's really sort of the, when they get up to college admission, I mean, guidance folks are finding these young people. And as a matter of fact, this morning I was just at a workshop down in New York City, the College Board, and there was a woman talking about a wonderful story about a young man who, immigrant young man, and had been in the same situation, very sort of tough neighborhood, gangs and everything. But, somehow or another, his SAT scores were critical reading of like 700 and 740 math or something like that. And an alumni, I guess, interviewed this young man, and he actually was undocumented. And the alumni was so impressed. This young man is now attending Harvard. Yeah, so.
Well, I think it's very important for college admission, at that level, college admissions officers to understand that an immigrant family often doesn't know what the landscape is in American colleges. If you forgive me for speaking personally again, when I went to Bronx Science. They had a very good average, but my parents knew nothing about college. They never went to college. They didn't know anybody who went to college. Not that I regret where I went. I was very pleased, and it gave me my profession. But I found this was true among other immigrant families. They don't know that your kid can get scholarships in lots of places. They don't know that you can, if your kid is having a problem with a certain subject, you can get a tutor, even, assuming they can afford it. They don't know, for example, they may also not want their kids to leave home. You find Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, for example, have formed an alliance with the city university to try to get more of their graduates into city university schools. And who's taking advantage of this? Immigrant families. The kids can go to the Ivies in many cases. They have terrific records, but they feel like they need to stay home, close to home, for their parents, because their parents don't speak English, or their parents can't navigate the system. Their parents have always relied on the kids to help them with Con Edison and immigration problems, because of the English involved. And I think too many colleges don't appreciate this problem with immigrants.
Okay, lots of people want to weigh in. Okay, please tell us your name.
My name's Meg Coyford. I'm curious, it seems like the discussion from the very beginning jumped into a paradigm when you had asked about their ambitions toward education. There was, and I don't want to get too far down in semantics, but it immediately jumped into the assumption of going to college. And I'm just curious about whether or not anybody has any comment about, is that really the only paradigm for success right now? Are we as schools, and I would argue as a former teacher, with the influence of No Child Left Behind, or in a school district such as yours, Dr. Freed, where you have clearly a very affluent community intermixed with a lot of socioeconomic and racial and immigrant diversity, you know, there's pressures to keep certain tags that identify the school system as successful. Percentage of people going on to college. Are we preparing people for the right jobs? And so, again, I don't want to get bogged down in semantics, but I'm just curious that the discussion immediately went into a discussion of college. And it's just a curious question to me.
Well, I think the question is really, is college necessary for, quote, success? Is that not what you're asking?
Or what is our definition of education for everyone, let alone for immigrant communities? And is it a dilemma because society as a whole continues to label that as the tag of success? Are we headed in the right direction? What is our definition of education? And that's kind of the
No, it's a large question, but
It is a large question.
but I think very simply, and this is again my perspective, I think the responsibility of our schools is to prepare our children well enough so that any child who would like to go on to college will have that opportunity. Now, if there's another road someone decides to take because of interests and skills and passions and so on, that's fine. But I think that we want to prepare children well enough that everyone has the skills and the opportunity, if they would like to seek college as their route, to a career, to an avocation, that exists. The troubling part of your question for me is that we're trying to prepare children for a world that we can't imagine. So, and again, the colleges, of course, have that same dilemma, but later on. But you know, if we look at things from a historical point of view, how rapidly things have changed in the last X amount of years, we can't imagine what the world will look like when our kindergartners are going to be ready to enter that world.
I think we're making a mistake, though, is in our preoccupation with college immediately following high school, or you know, an overemphasis on four-year schools sometimes as opposed to two-year schools. We don't do enough in terms of providing pathways that acknowledge that, particularly in the future, people will need to slide in and out of education in one way or another over time. It's not, you know, it's not something you can go and sort of like be inoculated, like you know, vaccination or something. You're good for a certain number of years. And one really fascinating project that we're involved with right now is a real win-win for us and our partner, and that is working with Phelps Hospital, which is right in our backyard, Sleepy Hollow. They have a need, as do most hospitals, for nursing staff and other kinds of paraprofessional and professional staff. And in particular, in our community, they have a need for Spanish-speaking staff. So we got together with them and developed a sort of a pathways for a progression through nursing, kind of a career ladder, where we start with students fairly young in high school that they can go through and actually work toward a credential of getting to be a nurse's aide. They can be employed there after school on weekends once they have that credential. Phelps will help assist them in helping to pay their tuition. They start to college to work on their LPN or RN, and we'll actually follow them right up through in connection with Mercy for a bachelor's degree. So we've got students who are kind of moving up to the pathway, but they're being allowed to work for a while, to go to school, and go back and forth like that, and not feel like they have to just put everything in the basket of immediately jumping into a four-year college. And that's opening some doors for some students who I don't think would necessarily have even ventured into a college education if it had been that sort of an abrupt notion.
I think implied in Meg's question, though, is the underlying question: is post-high school education going to be a requirement for survival in the coming world? I just finished Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, and you can give me a gold star. It's a tough read, but I think an important one. And Tom Friedman makes the case that businesses have the obligation to educate their employees as well as the market and the global economy changes, the job you were trained for may not be the job that you can continue in. And that businesses must continue to offer retraining, but that continued education after high school is not going to be a question mark, but a very important requirement.
Well, I mean, this is I mean, I'm sure everyone knows this. The jobs that could have required just a high school degree are swiftly disappearing. I mean, there will always be many of them, but they're decreasing. We no longer, I was driving through Bethlehem, Pennsylvania today, and you see the Bethlehem steel plant, and it goes on. Goes on for 2 miles of rust. That we're not producing steel anymore, at least in Pennsylvania, and those jobs are disappearing, and college is becoming, at least some college is becoming increasingly necessary. Of course, one could argue that if we cut access to college, we'd also probably do a lot better on illegal immigration, because we'd have to, all the people who are not going on to college would take some of the jobs that immigrants are now taking. But I think that's not a far-sighted, it's a near-sighted policy.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think whether we like it or not, I think everything says that some college education is the standard. Whether it's good, bad, different, or a direction to go, but every statistic comes out, shows you about the earning potential. It talks about a lot of jobs won't even interview you without a college education. Whether you should take it directly after high school or you need some more maturity, we used to talk about the Army as a way, or something like that. I'm old enough to remember that. But I think it's clear that it is. But I don't think it's an immigration issue. I mean, if that's the standard, that's the standard. And so.
Okay, you know what? We're going to go on to a couple of questions and then back to the audience. I promise we'll get you all in. I promise we'll stay here until we do. President Berman and Jose, let me ask you these questions. How do current immigration policies impact undocumented immigrant students who are enrolled in your school, and do those policies limit undocumented students' access to higher learning? And implicit in that, I'm sure you're going to want to comment on the DREAM Act.
I'll let him do the DREAM Act too. Because we're debating which one of us really knew more
He's the
about it or
vice
didn't.
president, so he gets.
That's what happens when you have your boss in there. I think one of the things that is very important, and I'm not so sure it's really an immigrant per se, but more of an undocumented issue. The truth is that if you continue on to a college campus and you are an undocumented student, graduate 4 years, and you continue to be undocumented, and you've gotten a wonderful grade point average, could be top of your class, the truth is you're still undocumented. So if you are somebody who's, can probably end up in a wonderful profession, you will have issues if you're undocumented with corporations and so forth. And they don't have the same experience. They can't study abroad like the rest of our students and take a study abroad program, because that would be quite dangerous for them. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, our career services office, as they're finding internships for students, might have a dilemma and try to place somebody in there. So I think in the middle of all this, that there are a lot of challenges for those who are undocumented. And at one point or another, Richard was very involved in trying to help out young people to make sure they were in the right path and doing the right things for, applying for documentation and things like that. And there are certain challenges. There certainly in policy has limited that for many of them. I mean, as of I guess about a year or two ago, there was an issue with them undocumented folks having a license here. State of New York, which has shifted now. Now they've turned that around, and I don't know what has happened back and forth, or at least the governor has decided to make a shift on that. But they can't drive, so or get a license to drive. So there are real challenges, particularly in academia for learning and knowledge. Well, that's I guess is available to them, and they probably will be the smartest people who graduate. The truth is, if they don't have that documentation, by the time they graduate from a college campus, then what will they do? So.
Once again, do you ask about documentation when a student applies?
Our application actually asks whether or not you're a citizen or a permanent resident. You know, there's some who fill it out, and some who leave it blank, and some who, are very honest through the process. We don't use federal or state funds to help them through their education. They're part of our Merit Aid program at Manhattanville, which comes directly from us. But the truth is, I don't think there's a college or university that could even know that if they pay up their own tuition. I think the costs of colleges and universities sometimes stop them from getting into certain colleges and so forth. But I think that, we look for students who are admissible into our college, and we look at all types of students who fall into that category. The state of the SUNY system, the state of New York, and the city system made a powerful statement because at one point or another, undocumented students were charged out-of-state tuition, even though they were residents in the state of New York. That shifted now. Now they're charged in-state tuition. So it's quite interesting. But they have been challenges, and I think folks are working at that. And just to make a statement, there are a lot of folks in Westchester County and in the state of New York who are really serving as bridges to help just immigrant families in general. It's funny, I make presentations about admissions all around Westchester, around the state of New York, around the world, but sometimes I find myself making these same presentations in English and in Spanish. So there are a lot of folks and a lot of advocates out there who are really supporting families.
Yeah, I think, to come back, I think to the extent cost is a barrier, which I really believe it is, to higher education, then there's no question that for both immigrants, documented and undocumented, it's a huge problem. And for those documented or undocumented, the idea of filling out a FAFSA form for financial aid will terrorize any of you in this room. If you think taxes are a problem, there's nothing quite like FAFSA, which includes your taxes. So it's more than that. So I think especially where you have a language issue, and in some cases you got families split across countries, and you talk to them about, let's see your 1040, and they're calling Kosovo and asking for their 10, or just even getting a certified diploma from high school. So I think it is a significant area and problem for both documented and undocumented because cost is a real issue. And even though we give merit aid and need-based aid, and we're very generous, and we like to be very generous, so any of you want to contribute can. But we can't do any need-based aid unless they fill out this FAFSA form, which is sort of the ticket to go forward. And that is almost impossible to fill. And then if they're not documented, then we can't use any federal aid, any state grant money, any type of subsidy we get. So to take one of those students would mean that we would have to find resources beyond, and a lot of corporations don't prefer their money not to go for those types of things. So you have to so we're very limited on the number of those types of kids we can help. And I think at the end of the day, we are all better as a society if everyone gets a great education. And to put a barrier up like this for kids who somehow we've been able to get parents involved, or in some cases not parents, but they've sort of risen above it and done it, and then to either deny them a college education when they could have been a contributing member of society, et cetera, or not finish this documentation. So now you've gotten them all the way through this system, and they can't go to law school because they can't get the documentation, they can't be doctors, they can't, and yet they have the potential to be great. We have, I was thinking of Edmund or or some of the others who have now gotten, we actually helped them get documented.
Yeah, you got the twin girl.
And we got the twin girls documented.
So you have the system within your school to be able to assist?
Well, we've created a system, I think.
A system might be sort of a glorified word.
Yeah, it's a glorified word. I don't think it's a real system, it's just.
John, would you just brief us, very briefly, on what the DREAM Act is?
To the extent that I know about it, but I'm not an expert on it, I will, yeah. It was killed yesterday because they couldn't get 60 votes for closure. They got 57 votes, but they couldn't get the 60 votes for
This
closure.
was in the Senate.
In the Senate, and they're threatening to filibuster, and so it's going to be another 2 years. My understanding of the bill that was before the Senate this year was that it said for students who've been in the States at least 6 years, who came with their parents, if they go to college or into the military, into a junior college or 2 years of a regular college or into the military, can get a temporary residence card, which would allow them both to enroll with a little bit more security and allow them to get student loans. And that on finishing those years, they could then apply for a permanent green card and get on a fast track to a permanent green card. There are a lot of little details in it that I have not read carefully, I will admit, but that was my understanding of the general principle behind it. It was students who had come with their parents, been here for a certain amount of time, and but they had to go to college, but 2 years, it wasn't the 4-year school, and they would be given a temporary resident card, which will allow them to work, allow them to drive, allow them to do other things in the meantime. I want to say one other thing about an earlier. I had a conversation today. I was just telling them a student came into my office and talked to me for about half an hour.
John, tell us where you were.
I teach at Purchase, and the state system has the same principle. They do not take status into account in admissions. You are eligible for in-state tuition if you have graduated from a New York high school. However, if you are not documented, you have to sign an affidavit saying that you intend to apply for residency. Probably fairly easy to do. But you are not eligible for any kind of financial aid, including student loans. And since I suspect much more than Manhattanville, almost everything we give is in one way or another from government funds. But I had a student come in today, and he spent half an hour telling me he had a very good friend who wanted to go to college and couldn't afford it and was worried about what he could do afterwards and how he could change his status. And as we talked, I began to realize the real tragedy of it. He wasn't talking about a friend. He didn't have the courage to tell me he was talking about himself. And I just found that tremendously sad. Anyway, that's the dream.
So give us his name.
Pardon? I'll give you his name? Yes, right.
Let's come
I won't even tell okay.
I think a lot of this goes back to the kind of schizophrenic attitude that too many Americans have about immigration. They want immigrants to cut their lawns and paint their houses at affordable prices and cook their food and serve them in restaurants at affordable prices. But they feel like there's been a great illegality committed by crossing the border, and we can't reward illegal actions. And maybe we just have to get over that kind of puritanical moralism and realize that if somebody's been here for 5 years, they really want to be here. They want to be part of this country, and we should find ways to accommodate that. Like the act you just mentioned. I suspect that if many Americans look back at their own roots, they would find grandparents and great-grandparents who came over here with some shady dealings and how they got here.
Hey, speak for yourself.
I will speak for myself. My parents told me when I was 21 that I wasn't born where I was born. I had always thought I was born in Poland. They told me, no, you were actually born in Russia, but we didn't admit that when we came here. So they obviously lied on whatever documentation they produced here, because in 1950, as you recall, it was the McCarthy period, and it wasn't too sharp to tell people you were in Russia. That wouldn't have helped them get here. They would not have been they would have been barred from coming here under the immigration law that applied at that time. So, and my mother, till this she has Alzheimer's now, but till this very day, till when she was sensible about it, never wanted to reveal this to anybody, because she thought she would be kicked out of the country. Now that's foolish that we've created a country, a national policy that makes people that scared to reveal themselves, to be who they are. And look what happened. She produced 3 kids who all did are doing great things for society. One's a doctor and one's a psychologist. And yet she lived in a kind of she lived a secret her whole life.
Tonight we're talking about immigration and education. One of the questions, or the first question I was going to pose to the superintendents of schools, was about the cost, to quantify the cost that immigration, that citizens must bear to educate immigrants. And as you informed me, you don't know the costs. You can't quantify what support services you need and how that impacts the budget in a school district. So I've retooled the question just a little bit, because I think Joe has brought us to this point. And you give me a moment and I will find it. You're unable to quantify the cost of an increased immigrant population, but perhaps you can speak to the change in educational programming and/or support services you have implemented to service a large immigrant population. More specifically, what educational services or programming have you put in place to service the immigrant population in your school districts at all levels? I know we touched on this a little bit before about the Parents' Council, but speaking specifically to educational support, what have you had to do to accommodate the population that your districts enjoy?
You can go back and forth a little bit. Just one of the things that it's interesting to look at it in retrospect and realize that there was never a point that you can identify when everybody suddenly woke up and said, oh my gosh, the composition of our population has changed. So you see things that have evolved. In many cases, I wish I could say they were more purposeful. In some cases, they were just very kind of almost accidental by default, just almost as a function of necessity. So some of the things we do are reactions. One of the first decisions you make is, to what extent are you going to have Spanish-speaking personnel in various roles in order to accommodate the language needs of your population? So, for example, as a matter of practice, we make sure that we have a Spanish-speaking person in each office where that deals with the public, either over the phone or in person. We try to translate as much as we can in Spanish. So you look at a series of practices and policies and resources to try to make sure that people can communicate with you and parents. We were talking earlier about the importance of being able to connect with parents, and so that was a commitment that we made, and a lot of schools in the situation make. Interestingly enough, a teacher who is a teacher, ESL teacher, the other day though raised a question with me was asking how things were going with their high school students, and she said that she was seeing what she felt, she's been with us for a while, a little bit of a decline in interest in learning English among some of the high school students, which she attributed to the comfort level that we've created in our schools for speaking Spanish. And she started to recite it, and I realized this, in our lunch line, most of the women who serve in the lunch line are Hispanic and speak Spanish, and kids said, and I stand in line every day to get my chicken nuggets and other good food. And I hear it, and I watch the kids interacting, and a lot of times they interact in Spanish. The bus drivers speak Spanish, the bus monitors speak Spanish. They can go into any office and talk with somebody in Spanish. Make sure their guidance counselors, at least some of them, speak Spanish, and so on. We have teachers in every content area that speak Spanish. So we make these accommodations And then it now raised the question by somebody who's very invested in this professionally, have we gone too far? And so that was sort of got me thinking a little bit of a bird walk there inside, but it was just an interesting recent experience I had. But, so there are those kinds of things, and then there are the educational programs. And certainly one of the things that we do, and I know you did this in Ossining too, you can't get them too early. We have a program that's grant funded called Even Start. That's really a family literacy program, and people often mistakenly think that it's about serving preschool children, and it is, but more secondarily, the real target population is parents, and helping them develop skills in practices in their home that promote literacy. And the example that I think just, again, that illustrates a lot of what we face in schools, I can go into CVS in our community and see two sets of parents, both of whom, have sent children to our school. Have one father who's got a kid, maybe a 3-year-old, kind of propped up and patiently reading the label of all of the products, explaining why this one is different than this one, and the ingredients and all this kind of stuff. And there'd be another situation where kids running around the CVS unattended, and the only communication between the parent and the child would be very functional level communication. And so part of what we're dealing there is just sort of that kind of disparity in outlook, and if we try to accommodate that in schools, we really have to help parents understand all the moments in their lives that are mundane, that can be educational, the way instinctively some of our more educated and affluent parents just sort of know that.
There's a lot of levels, I think, to the conversation, and we in Mamaroneck have an interesting situation. District-wide, our Latino population makes up about 14% of our school district, but in one of our schools, Mamaroneck Avenue School, it's about 48%. In our other 3 elementary schools, at Central School, it's more diverse, but at Murray and Chatsworth, it's almost non-existent. One of the things that I looked at when I first arrived was where are we with compliance in terms of providing English as a second language services to students. And we began to add staff members in order to be at compliance at that point, because that was certainly important to do. The way I look at it philosophically, though, is that all of our students come to school with strengths and weaknesses, whether or not they're second language learners, whether or not they may have some difficulty with reading, whether or not they have strengths in different areas. They all come with certain requirements and certain individual needs to fulfill. And so for our second language learners, they require some sort of specific interventions to move them forward in the educational process. Sitting right alongside one of our second language learners may be a child who was born right here in Larchmont who is having some reading difficulty. And from a different service point of view, he or she is receiving almost identical service, but just with a different provider. So it's our goal in the schools to really begin to take children from where they are and move them forward in the process. And regulations require us, though, to have different programs at times, depending on where children find themselves, based on standardized tests or based on particular areas of weakness. Something else that we began to look at carefully in the Mamaroneck schools was what happens to our students when they come from the security of an elementary school like Mamaroneck Avenue School, where we do have many resources for our second language learners, and move into a Homix Middle School, where the resources, where it's a much larger school, so our children have gone from being almost a 50-50 split, so to speak, in terms of population, to again a 14% minority. And so what we began to do there is 2 things. One was we hired a bilingual school social worker, so that as the children gained entrance into the middle school, the parents had resources, so that they had people they could turn to. The other thing we did is, in partnering with the Mamaroneck Schools Foundation, we began to see that children coming from our elementary schools who were, again, children of second language families who might have been involved in things like band and orchestra, and in the Mamaroneck Avenue School, the band and the orchestra have many Latino children in it. When they got to the Homix, there were almost no Latino children in that school's band and orchestra. So we began to wonder why, and the Mamaroneck Schools Foundation generously provided us with an opportunity to both fund children having additional lessons in their instrument during that summer, as well as in terms of rental for instruments, to put children on a more level playing field. Because many of the children in our community come from families where private lessons are the norm. But with our Latino families, that wasn't the case.
Has that increased their participation at the junior and senior high school levels?
We're still looking at that since that program is just about a year old now. So it's something we are going to be looking at. When we look at our youngest learners, as Howard just mentioned, from his Even Start program, in Mamaroneck we have begun what I alluded to before, a program for families and their children from birth through 3 years of age. We call it Small Treasures. This program is funded by 2 benefactors in our community who have given us enough money starting last year and now this year for the second year to fund a program which is 3 days a week. We house it at Mamaroneck Avenue School. And while it's open to all of our families in the community, it is heavily attended by our Latino families. And it's a way for our families to begin to look at how do you play with your children at an early age, the importance of reading aloud to your children. We know that in our more affluent families, literally people are reading to their children before they're born, right? While they're in the womb, they're reading to their children. And Howard used that example of the affluent families reading the cereal box to their 1-year-old, while again in our families coming from other countries, that's not been the norm. And so how do we transmit a culture that has made our children coming from, again, our more affluent families so successful? How do we transmit that? And so we're trying to do that at the very youngest ages. And hopefully that eliminates the need for more ESL teachers and more kinds of services for children who in other words, trying to have children start school being ready for school. What we've heard, of course, from our federal government, No Child Left Behind, that one of the education goals was to have all children ready for school by a mysterious date is 2013. And while that is a terrific goal, and I'm sure everyone in this room believes in that goal strongly, we don't see more resources to go toward the fulfillment of those goals. And so again, we're looking, again, with the generosity of the community right here, to be able to help our children be ready for school.
One thing I would just add to, as far as a sort of a major decision you make at school district, he was talking about the different, you've had experience both with Ossining, with the model, which I think is the same as ours, the plan, and the model here. In our district, years ago, I think in a really represented remarkable foresight, and part of the people who made that decision, went with the Princeton plan, which essentially clustered all the children in one grade level in one place. Because we're about 50% Latino and about 37% white, and then the rest African American and smattering of other minorities. But so we haven't. What that does is it replicates the mix in your community in the from day one in each educational setting. I think that pays off immeasurably, particularly by the time the students get into middle school, because there isn't that reshuffling of and remixing of students. They've been part of the mix all the way along, and there's a certain comfort level that they've developed, but it creates a series of other challenges too. And again, in an area like ours, it's a very interesting dynamic when you are a white person and you're a minority in a Westchester suburb. And yet also the dynamics go along with that too. Is the minority is still the most influential group, so the majority is not the most influential. And so there are all kinds of sort of counterbalancing considerations that a Board of Education has to consider in putting together a system that's seen as truly serving the needs of the entire population. And so another thing that we've been really trying to do is to find ways to show that, look, this is not a liability, this is an asset. So we started a universal Spanish program in kindergarten all the way up through the grades. So we've now built it up through the elementary levels so that every child, as part of their experience, learns some Spanish. And what it's been really fun to watch for a child in the classroom who now used to always have to think of Spanish as being sort of the second best language around. There's a point in the day when they're the ones who can, who can tell somebody else, what something means and be the stars for a while, even as early as kindergarten, and share that with them. And we have so many naturally occurring opportunities in the community. It's very amusing to see people come to Sleepy Hollow with visions of Washington Irving and all that stuff in your head. Take a left off of Broadway and go down Beekman Avenue, which is like the main street of Sleepy Hollow, and look around and every sign on every store is in Spanish, and all the people walking up and down the street are Latino, and they're asking each other, did I make a wrong turn somewhere? But it's, there are all kinds of opportunities to kind of take that sort of micro economy that has been developed with menus in Spanish and food that represents the culture, sort of bring that in and treat it as something to be celebrated. And we've actually gotten quite a positive response.
On the college level, have you had to make educational accommodations? Or any kind of support for immigrant students?
Well, again, part of what we believe, or what I believe, is that for us to equip the students to be able to live in Friedman's world, which is a much more global world, they have to learn to live and work and play in a very diverse community. So for me, the international population, the immigrant population, have added opportunities for learning, as opposed to costing me more in a funny way, other than financial aid or other things like that. But when you have, a diversity of religions, and you now have, in addition, we were a Catholic women's school, and in addition to now having a Catholic priest, we have a rabbi, and we have an imam, and we have this is all really in part of the educational experience that they're going to have if they're going to be effective in a global world. So I can't imagine, if you sort of sit back and say, I can't imagine sort of living in a white Wonder Bread, if anybody remembers those days, sort of experience for college and thinking that you're prepared for the world. So for me, it's a much more positive sort of sense of, that's why we have students from 60 countries. I have kids who are now, they literally grew up with their families in refugee camps, Palestinians in a refugee camp in Jordan, from the West Bank, Jewish kids from Tel Aviv, and et cetera. And, I don't know how you could prepare kids unless you have this type of environment. So, we see it as a struggle to make it work. But as you were saying, there's so many rich educational opportunities that you could never create in any other way. And we have, we still teach most of our courses other than language courses in English, but there are some I guess, film courses now taught in Spanish. Latin American Studies. And it's interesting because, you end up with non-Latino kids taking it and enjoying it. I talk about having Sabbath dinners at my house where less than half the kids are Jewish because people want to learn about it and hear about it, participate in it, and that sort of thing. So I think for, at least in our college, I can't think of really a single, again, other than we had to get more help for figuring out the financial aid, but I find that to be an issue for first generation to go to college, regardless if they're white born here for, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a real problem, sort of the forms and the timing, and if they've never gone to college. And this is their first kid.
It's much harder than it was when Joe went to City College, right? The administrative work that you need to do to get to college. Thank you. So you're really exploiting the differences and using them in an educational fashion rather than seeing them as a liability. Jose, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, one of the things that Richard talks about, and that is sort of that global vision, that preparation for it. I mean, I was fortunate enough to have part of my education in a different country where I had a teacher who just spoke 9 languages, and that was fine. That's what she did. And then I see some of our graduates who are going out there, and guess what? Thomas Friedman, Bangalore, you know what? Some of our graduates are now being sent to Bangalore by the local corporation around the corner. I have a guy who's a senior scientist at Pepsi right now. And, he lives a month in Mexico and then lives another month in Belgium somewhere. I mean, that's the way life is these days. It's really becoming about global economies and, being enriched. And we talk about, you can learn a language. You got to learn the culture behind that language. Even among the Spanish-speaking folks, there is cultures behind each individual families that you're working with in certain ways that we react. And, I just think that opportunity to learn about people from all around the world, all walks of life, religions, and everything, is something that really is going to prepare young people for a future that we're not sure about. But you know what? We're going to end up, we're connected. We're very well connected. Thomas Friedman talks about it, and a lot of people talk about it, and a lot of people are companies now. They, call up your local Walmart and call the 800 number and say that you're concerned with something. You might be speaking to somebody in the Philippines or somebody in Bangalore these days. So,
and our students, for instance, we keep our library open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we have trouble, as you can imagine, staffing with reference librarians all the time. So we now have a service with reference librarians. I guess it's now 24 hours, 7 days a week. I assure you, they're not all in America. And so whether it's time or whether it's just the way you live, and let me tell you also that when our other students study abroad, instead of the traditional places of Venice and Paris, etc., they're finding some amazing new opportunities, whether it's with the Maasai in Kenya or whether it is, again, around the world. And when they know of a kid in school whose family is over there, it is a much different educational experience. And I think very rich and very broad. And, we see it here in some of the schools where they're starting to teach Chinese and then they want to take the kids over to China for a little bit. Well, again, if you start doing that at early ages, it will really have an impact if they get to understand something more than the language. I think that's my push, is that this is about culture. This is about understanding other people. This is about understanding what your words are like. In my hands, in some countries that I was in when they were eating with their hands and I was throwing my hands all over the place, I had to figure out that was not what you're supposed to do. So until I did it, you can tell me all day and I won't remember it.
Richard, let's let Joe have a say on this, and then we're going to go to the audience for your questions. I promise I won't leave you out.
I just was going to say that I'm very happy to hear that the Tarrytown Sleepy Hollow system offers Spanish starting from kindergarten, because in America, we're one of the few developed countries that starts foreign languages so late. I don't know what it is in the Mamaroneck, but in most school systems, you start in the 7th grade. You start taking a language in junior high school. And that probably relates to a certain kind of chauvinism and provincialism on our part. And I think it's wonderful to start language. Kids can swallow 2 languages simultaneously, maybe even 3 in some cases. And why we push that off to so late a date? First of all, not only does it help in terms of learning another culture, but it also helps in terms of learning English. I venture to say that if we required all our first, second, third graders to learn another language, they would learn how a language operates, and they would improve their English skills.
Stemming from the question that was just asked, cost is one issue, but a closely related issue is performance and how the school does. In contrast to the scenario described by Dr. Smith, Mamaroneck has actually had a radical change, especially in the village of Mamaroneck, I know I was looking at the test scores for the fourth grade tests, and they had these statistics for the population at Mamaroneck Avenue School, and in 2005, 2006, it was 40% Hispanic, and now you're telling me 48, so we could see an 8% increase. That's pretty dramatic over one school year. My question to you is, what has been the real impact on the school? And I'm interested to hear from Dr. Freed as to what can you say, tangible examples of what's happened. I know I coach a soccer team with 12 girls, 3-4 of which are of this category, not originally from the United States, and a lot of times they take up a lot of effort. I want them there, I have to get the parents to spend the money even though they want to spend it on something else. It takes a lot of effort for me. I'm thinking in the classroom, this is a real issue, so I'd like to hear your response.
Well, I think also implicit in that, very good question, implicit in that is in this time when there's so much quantitative analysis of students and their scores, and the perception of a school district is based on scores, how do the numbers of students affect the perception of our school district, and what would you change if you could? So.
Sure. Well,
Enough to
I apologize. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I had the opportunity.
I didn't mean it, but I had the opportunity.
The definition of my job is being put on the spot. So in terms of resources and what it means to us at Mamaroneck Avenue School, for example, as the population of our Latino children grow, there are many kind of pieces to it. As I said earlier, we brought more ESL services to that school. That school has a full-time bilingual school social worker as well. We do, one thing we also did, we began this last year, is we have a full-time clerical person in our district whose job it is to only translate. So this individual actually has a office in our central office complex, but translates documents for parents and families, is also available to be at Committee on Special Education meetings and superintendents' disciplinary hearings if necessary, so in places so that they can be a resource to our parents. Anecdotally, in speaking to the building principal of Mamaroneck Avenue School, Carrie Amon, one of the challenges we face is that very often families that come to us from South American countries oftentimes have a need to go back and visit their families. And so what we find is that there'll be gaps in their learning because they may take an extended vacation period. So for example, they may leave in the beginning of December and come back in February. And so that gap in learning becomes an issue as we're trying to, of course, bring children along academically. So that's a real challenge that we face in terms of consistent attendance leading to student achievement. So we have provided resources to assist on many different levels. The other thing is that we do, in fact, have more resources at Mamaroneck Avenue School with regard to reading specialists. Class size is actually different in Mamaroneck Avenue School than our other 3 elementary schools because, again, we have more needs within every classroom. So we do try to keep class size at a lower level. So we do make accommodations to meet needs in that building in different ways than we might in our other elementary schools where the student population is more homogeneous. I know there was another part to the question about...
Well, the part that we added is in this time when there's so much evaluation or quantitative analysis of students' performance, how does it impact our perception, or the perception of, in this case, Mamaroneck schools?
Right. I'm a very, very big believer that students, whether they're in a school that's diverse or in a school that's more homogeneous, that students are going to, in fact, rise and succeed. And a lot of that does have to do with, as we know in America, unfortunately, socioeconomic status, parent involvement, and these kinds of factors. And we're certainly looking for those answers within our immigrant population to be able to help the success rate increase there as well. So I'm not at all worried about our individual students, no matter what schools they're in within our school district, succeeding and doing well. They will. from a outsider's perspective, if they in fact look across a global, in a global kind of way, and they see the average SAT score, for example, declining, what they have to actually do is stop and think about, is it declining because truly our children are not doing as well as they did 10 years ago? Or is it declining because we now are being more inclusive and offering the SAT to more and more children, which I believe is our mission and the goal of our school district. It's the same.
The population is different as well.
Population is different, and so we're actually opening up the doors, if you will, and opening up the gates. We may see this phenomenon in AP classes, for example, that we open up AP classes to more and more students, or in any kinds of offerings. So I think, again, from a perception point of view, in diverse communities, we're always going to see there's a difference in a very homogeneous community compared to a diverse community. I'm confident to say that if we asked Howard to break out his school district statistically and looked at the segment of the Tarrytown schools that resembled, for example, Chatsworth Avenue School, that we would see very equal kinds of success and achievement rates. And I think, again, we see that across all of our schools in this country. It is a challenge to meet to have children who are coming to us with the disadvantage, if you will, in our country of coming to us as a second language learner without that educational background when they're very young. The other thing that's happened nationally with No Child Left Behind, and I think this is a real policy issue, is that there has been a change in when our students have to begin to take standardized tests. And our second language learners now have to take these tests after only being in our country for 1 year, as opposed to, I think it was 3 years before. And this is going to, from this time forward, cause drops in these achievement test scores. It's just going to be a statistical reality that we're going to see these drops.
When was that changed? Is that brand new?
Last spring's the
Last
first
spring.
year.
So they have to be in here in the country 1 year?
1 year.
Versus it
So
used to be 3 years.
imagine yourself being transported suddenly to Israel and in 1 year being asked to pass a high school test of a certain kind when you're in fact sitting in classes initially and not understanding one word of the language, and yet 1 year later having to pass a chemistry regents. That's the equivalent of what we're asking children to do now. And that is again going to have repercussions for test scores across all of our communities that have diversity.
Just very quickly, I would just add
Yeah,
that
no, please, go ahead.
on that issue, I think what we're trying to do is to help people take the long view. There's not enough of that. There's so much urgency surrounding this year-to-year notion, and we're not even measuring the same children. We look at fourth grade scores this year and fourth grade scores next year. Those are two different groups of children. So one of the things we're trying to promote is of taking a longer-term view, and we follow our students, and our sort of mantra is the longer they're with us, the better they do. And if we try to make sure that we can, because we get hammered on this testing issue, and we got killed last spring when a significant portion of our population that normally would have been exempt suddenly had to take an English language arts test after being here 1 year. But if we follow those children over time, I mean, most of the research on English language acquisition or in foreign language, second language acquisition, it's a 5 to 7 year process to really get it to the point where it's cognitively kind of ingrained in your. You can. One of the real dangers is you can create the impression that you're fluent in a year on a social level. But that doesn't necessarily penetrate when it comes to reading and writing and more sophisticated tasks. And so we have to educate our communities that, look, follow it over time and look at end results and statistics, and even things like, for example, the state still puts a premium on graduating in 4 years. Well, in a standards-based environment, you can't treat, if your standard is fixed, then you cannot treat time as fixed also. Time has to be the variable if standards are fixed. So what's wrong if it takes somebody 5 years to meet the same standard, if they meet the same standard? And so those are other kinds of things at kind of policy level where we have to help people be more comfortable that it's okay to take longer if you achieve the same result.
May I ask both superintendents, for younger kids, I understand the issue you're raising with older immigrant kids, but for younger kids, doesn't that put more pressure on the school system, maybe in a good way, to get over the English hurdle a little faster, rather than insulate kids from exposure to English?
Pressure is sort of the operative word, and that's part of what we try to, the balance is
Well, I don't
how much
think
is,
pressure is
what's
not the
good
word, but
pressure and what's.
Good pressure, right, yeah.
I think one thing we did, for example, is we dismantled our bilingual education programs in the elementary grades. We used to bring children to kindergarten and immediately put them in a separate class. Now we basically use a sheltered immersion approach, where we have a teacher and a teacher assistant in each class. We make sure one of them is Spanish speaking, and then we mix up our population, spread them across all the classes from day one. So we did that in a deliberate attempt to try to accelerate the English
That's
language
what I was
process.
getting at, right.
But what we still run into problems with, these are children who go home to Spanish-speaking environments, and so we need to provide ways to support them. It creates some difficult circumstances for them when they're going back and forth like that. We can't completely, shelter them.
Paul, do you feel pressure?
The reality is, in the Mamaroneck, no, because we still, again, have a large majority of our children are from affluent English-speaking homes, and so spread across the entire school district, our statistics are still very, very positive, and people look at our community in that kind of way. So while I think we can focus our efforts also on meeting the needs of our non-English speaking children, and certainly have that as one of our goals, I don't feel the same kind of pressure that, for example, I felt when I was in the Ossining schools, which are very much more akin to the diversity that the Tarrytowns has. But I can say that as someone who's been through both experiences, it is just a very, very, how would I term it, almost unjust kind of characterization that diverse school systems have to bear under the pressures that we're receiving through No Child Left Behind, and through the real estate agents, and through all of the people in communities that characterize school districts in a certain way. I can tell you that in the school districts across Westchester County, that there is fine education taking place, and I think it's really just so unjust that a school district, whether it's Tarrytown, Ossining, Ellensford, no matter where it is characterized in a certain way because the average test score is at a certain level. Howard has kids who go to Harvard and Yale and every place else because they're coming from the same kinds of households that many of our children within the large Mamaroneck communities are going to. And his teachers are graduating from the same fine schools of education, and they're being paid good salaries, and they have great resources and community support. So having experience in both kinds of communities, I can say that it's just a very unjust characterization, and I know we as superintendents really take, really are very concerned about the way sometimes that these polls rank our high schools in our community of Westchester County.
There's so many, Jose, why don't you, if you have a word to say, that you can see there's so many questions, and
Sure. Actually, the only word that I find very interesting in this whole conversation, I commend everybody for all the hard work, was that I, in fact, was one of those folks who came to this country where English was clearly my second language, and my mom refused to put me in any of these programs, and had a battle inside the New York City system to why I had to be put in certain programs and on all types of things like that. And they finally gave up. She was screaming pretty loud, and made sure, and I was in a regular curriculum. And yeah, it was pretty difficult for me, but I would just say one thing to you. As we look at these children who are recent immigrants, consider what their academic background was before they arrived. Even though they were speaking in another language, sometimes they're sharp and bright enough to be in accelerated type programs that will in fact get them up there.
So much more we could explore. Who hasn't had a chance? Denise?
My name's Denise Larkin. One thing I wanted to bring up is that as the number of standardized tests have increased, I think the dropout rate has increased as well in the immigrant population in high schools, from what I understand. And one of the points you brought up earlier were the cultural factors, like the one where the families go back for an extended period of time. I was wondering if you can elaborate on some more cultural factors that impact our educational system and how they influence our educational system on the different levels of schools.
Great question.
Certainly see it in cultural attitudes and expectations sometimes around males versus females, unfortunately. We fight a certain tendency for lower aspirations in culturally and part of females, of females by their families, or more of a pressure to stay near home, and actually more support for getting pregnant early. Those are all, again, having a child at a young age is actually sort of, it's not a bad thing. And so those kinds of things also get in the way of sometimes, completing the whole high school process. So a lot of what you have to do is find ways to support that. How do you support the young women, both if they do get pregnant and get them back in school and deal with issues like childcare? How do you help families establish or feel comfortable holding higher goals for them than they might naturally tend to do that? Again, our program with Phelps has been very successful in that regard because they can see an opportunity for a daughter and not be concerned that the daughter is to move away to take advantage of it. And so you find ways to accommodate and can gradually help people with some of those notions. We don't see, as long as we provide support for make sure that our students feel okay about spending an extra year if they don't pass that English Regents exam and can't graduate in 4 years, and provide supports there, we can get them back. So in our case, for example, our dropout rate isn't any more significant than any school anywhere, here or anywhere else. But not if you look at it in terms of whether they necessarily finish in 4 years.
What about multicultural workshops or education for teachers? Is that provided?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But even more importantly, helping teachers to learn how to teach in ways that acknowledge certain differences coming in. And you cannot teach a class of English language learners, if you're a regular classroom teacher, the same way as native English speakers and expect to get the same results.
We have at Manhattanville been concerned about how do we help teachers in the districts learn to adjust their teaching to be responsive to some of the things you're hearing. And so, and there's some people in the room who have been more helpful than I am. I just know about it as the president. I don't do anything. But it's called the Changing Suburban Institute. And what we've been doing is trying to work on programs that deal with the issues that you're raising here and work with the superintendents and work with the districts in order to provide some both lecture seminars, ongoing development for teachers to deal with it.
Anybody else on this issue? No? Okay, let's go on to another question. Yes, Mariana.
My question is, we have discussed the challenges, and certainly there are many. What we have not discussed maybe is the opportunities and how not the immigrants, but those who are local can take advantage of the educational opportunity of diversity. How is that incorporated in the curriculum, if at all?
I think Richard approached that, and Jose on the college level, but so I
But
guess this question is really towards the
college level
public
is
schools.
much later. I mean, values earlier is interesting.
I think, of course, that my sense of school, public school in particular, is that the more inclusive, the better. And I think that the inclusive nature of bringing our children together at the youngest ages is, whether or not they're special needs children, second language learners, and so on, makes for an environment that I think produces healthier communities and opportunities for children to learn from one another. I can't say that we're purposeful in terms of curriculum offerings that put that together. Perhaps we need to be at times. But I can say that bringing children together from the earliest ages, not segregating children, I think that we've probably done a better job with our special education population in terms of the efforts toward in specific inclusion purpose programs with special training, if you will, for teachers. There's probably been a greater effort made in that area. I think, again, it's I don't want to say it's deceiving a bit in Mamaroneck, but again, when our large group of percentage of children at one school become a much smaller group, and you and I have actually talked about this at the middle school and high school, there does not seem to be that same feeling of urgency any longer. Mamaroneck Avenue School was very purposeful with all its activities because of the concentration. And we need to think of ways to make that urgency continue for our second language learners in the middle and high school.
Is there any talk here of going to the Princeton plan that Tarrytown has? Princeton's program, is that where schools Princeton plan, where schools are grouped according to age rather than neighborhood school concept?
Has there been any talk
Have I asked a question?
You want to announce that new initiative right here, Paul?
Sure. Are you thinking of running for mayor?
If I did, I would plan away very fast.
Once I announce it, I'll have to check what the new openings are.
George Latimer just came into the back, so. Take a detailed notes.
Well, it's interesting because I'll be at social events around the community, and actually people will begin to talk to me about those kinds of plans, and I've been a bit surprised that people seem to have an interest, and their interest is very healthy. They'll talk to me about the fact that they believe some of our schools are too homogeneous, and they would love to have their children have the opportunity to be more involved in diversity and in those opportunities before their children get into the middle school. But I think, again, the way our county is structured, the way our country is structured, it's often about real estate. And I think that, to be very frank, I think that in this community that would be a very large issue.
And of course, the recent Supreme Court decision doesn't make it easier to move people around. Like I was wondering, would the decision that basically bars the use of race in school assignment plans, would that affect the Princeton plan, or is that actually the Princeton plan something that can pass muster under that?
Yeah, it does, because it does,
it doesn't use race.
blind.
It just says all first graders, all second graders.
Right.
Yeah. Austining has this plan, by the way.
Oh, it does?
Yes. So again, I've come from a system.
So you've seen it from both sides now?
For 19 years that has this plan.
We are just about out of time, and I know you all have questions. So we're going to be able to stay around for a few more minutes because I've got the key to the library, so I can let us out anytime we want. Anybody want to have a last word?
I just was going to say, to answer Mariana's question, that I think, and I don't know whether it's being done or not, but I think it'd be wonderful, given the numbers of parents from Peru and Ecuador, and that ways be found to have parents who can speak English well enough to address a class to come in and talk about life in Ecuador and Peru and Mexico, all the other countries that people come from, because they are this kind of resource, and it would also help acquaint children with some of these other cultures, and I thought that's what you meant by using.
Mamaroneck is very diverse. We have students from Croatia, Korea, Japan. It's a really very diverse, and it's a wonderful thing.
I think Joe has a committee chair.
There you go.
I know you have more questions, and we're going to stay around. You're going to have an opportunity to speak with our panelists. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation as much as we appreciate your being here. And I'd like to all thank our guests and our experts for sharing their expertise and leading us in this conversation. Thank you all.